Good morning, everybody. Rather good afternoon, South Africa time. And thank you for joining this daily Maverick webinar on the subject of a basic income grant and the long-term impact of universal basic income. I'm very happy. My name is Mark Heywood to be hosting a discussion that I think is very topical with three people who are leading subject experts on the question of a basic income grant and introducing you, our audience, to these ideas and why, as I think our panelists will argue, a basic income grant is an idea or a proposal whose time has come. So I want to welcome you wherever you are in the world. I know that there's been interest in this webinar from all over Southern Africa and other parts of the world, and I hope that you will enjoy the next hour and that you will learn and that this discussion will stimulate your own ideas. We're very privileged to have three people who, as I've already said, are, I believe, world experts on this issue. We have Kelle Howson. Good morning, Kelle, and thank you for joining us. Kelly's a senior researcher at the research specialist at the Institute for Economic Justice and is one of the authors of a very recent publication by the IEJ, Can a Universal Basic Income Contribute to Breaking Structural Poverty in South Africa? And you can access this publication on the IEJ website, and I think a link will be posted in the chat in the course of our conversation as well. Kelle will be introducing this morning's discussion in a few minutes, but we'll get to that just now. We're also joined by Hein Marais. Welcome, Hein. Nice to see you.
Nice to be here.
Hein is an independent writer and researcher with a long pedigree of books, but Hein's most recent book is a book called In the Balance, The Case for a Universal Basic Income in South Africa and Beyond, and that book is published by the Wits University Press, and I would also recommend it to everybody who's interested in this discussion. And then finally, we will be joined just before 12:30 by Zimbali Mncube, who is the head of Budget Justice at the Institute for Economic Justice, and who will help us in the conversation get to grips with some of the issues, particularly as far as they pertain to budgeting and affordability and so on in the South African context. So, welcome, and before I ask Kelle to kick us off, and whilst we still wait for people to join us, I just want to say a little bit on the context to this discussion and why I think it's relevant and newsworthy. Last week, we had the latest medium-term budget policy statement. It's a budget policy statement that has been welcomed in some quarters and criticized very strongly from other quarters. But one of the things that the budget policy statement did was to extend a social relief of distress grant, 350 Rand a month, that I think currently is received by about 7 million people in South Africa, and link it to a still rather vague promise of the possibility of introducing a basic income grant at some point in future in South Africa. I think that linkage was made because there's recognition that social security in South Africa contains a huge hole, particularly when it comes to the adult unemployed. In our country here, adult unemployment, I believe, is 34 point something %. Youth unemployment is way over 60%. And as a consequence, there are millions of people who even if they want to, are unable to earn an income, and because they have no access to money, are barred from participating as ordinary citizens of a modern society. And I think that is one of the issues that this basic income grant, basic income guarantee, universal basic income, however we choose to frame it, is intended to address. And the last thing I'd like you to think about as we hear the presentations is that this discussion is not really just about something that would be a nice to have. In South Africa, we're a constitutional democracy with a unique Bill of Rights. And our Bill of Rights says that everyone, the word is everyone, has a right of access to social security, including, if they are unable to support themselves and their dependents, appropriate social assistance. But we know that at this moment in time, as we have this conversation, people between the ages of 18 and 60 have no social security if they are unemployed. So that's what the discussion is about. As I said, we have some of the world's leading authorities on this issue. And so I'm going to hand over now to Kelle Howson. And Kelle is going to introduce this morning's discussion with approximately 10 minutes input that will provide the background to this issue, the thinking, and also give us some insight into this paper that has been produced by the IEJ. She'll be followed by Hein Marais, who will act as a kind of respondent, but who will also flag issues that have come up in his research. And then we will begin our conversation. I'd urge everybody who's with us today to participate actively, use the chat line, raise questions, raise comments, raise disagreements. Feel free, be respectful, but let's make the best of the hour that we have for this very, very important discussion. So Kelle, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you also to the Daily Maverick team for facilitating this important discussion and providing a platform to discuss the IEJ's recent work on the long-term impacts of a UBIG in South Africa. I think most of the audience would agree, and picking up on some of Mark's comments already, that something's got to give in South Africa. Crisis conditions have become so normalized that we live our lives in the midst of a sense of helplessness and despair and the horror of worsening poverty and inequality. I think there's a sense that economic and societal stability is hanging by a thread, and also that it's bad now, but what we're heading towards is potentially worse. And against this backdrop, the possible introduction of a basic income grant is often framed as a grim choice or a last resort to alleviate immediate suffering, and perhaps also even an admission that growth strategies and job creation have failed. It feels all but impossible to imagine a new deal or a future for South Africa that is truly transformed and inclusive. In this context, debates about a basic income grant, I think, have become stuck in a narrow imaginary, seeing it as at best delaying the coming storm and at worst even hastening it. But in many places around the world, basic income, and especially universal basic income, which we'll unpack a little further, is seen as an exciting possibility for charting a new developmental path, an affirmation of our collective humanity and our right to a decent life, as well as a growth and productivity strategy in and of itself, a way to break away from old paradigms that aren't fit for purpose anymore. But equally, in a lot of places, it's a dream that remains on the political margins. It's not seen as an option that's really on the table. And I think it's ironic in some ways that it is a real option on the table in South Africa today. We do have a window of political opportunity, but it feels to me like, for the most part, this is not necessarily based on a shared vision for a new paradigm, but instead feels a bit like it's because we're running out of other options. And I think it's important to reinsert an articulation of the future we want to see into debates around a basic income grant. And to do this, we need to gather evidence about the long-term structural impacts we could see with a basic income grant. But as an important caveat to this, I think it's also important to say that these impacts depend on how the grant is designed and implemented. And at IEJ, while we welcome any expansion of the social protection system to cover more people than it already covers, especially unemployed adults, ultimately what we advocate for is a universal basic income grant. And a universal basic income grant, sometimes called UBIG or just UBI, is a grant that everybody is eligible to receive on the basis of citizenship or residency every month with no strings attached. In the IEJ's proposals, we've suggested that this should apply to all adults between the ages of 18 to 59. And along with many other organisations, we've done a lot of past work on the relative benefits of a universal BIG compared to a targeted BIG, or a grant that is, for instance, targeted only at unemployed people or people with incomes below a certain threshold. Many people's first reaction to the idea of universality is understandably, this seems inefficient. Why should people who already have money be eligible to receive this grant? But there are actually many ways in which a universal basic income grant is more practical, more efficient, and more sensible than other narrow or targeted approaches to social protection. So firstly, it's much easier and less costly to administer. It cuts down both on bureaucracy as well as on possibilities for fraud and corruption. Also, targeted grants inevitably, in all cases, exclude people who they are intended to benefit. We've seen this with the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, which millions of rightful beneficiaries have missed out on since at least April this year, due to unmanageable conditions and constraints being imposed on eligibility. And the bureaucratic complexity of targeting this grant to the most vulnerable has actually had the opposite than intended effect. And it's meant that authorities have simply failed to roll out the grant. And there's been an estimated underspend on the budget of approximately 1/3 so far this year. By contrast, with a universal grant, clawback mechanisms can be instituted to ensure that the wealthy pay more in tax than they gain in benefits. So this ensures that the benefits still accrue to those who need them most, while also making sure that nobody can be left behind. So our starting point is that universality is desirable. But there are very few international examples of where a universal basic income has actually been trialled for a whole country. So we need to turn to evidence from smaller scale, time-limited or targeted trials to help us in predicting the possible outcomes of a universal basic income in South Africa. And the international evidence is clear. Cash transfers set at a meaningful level can have significant structural impacts. From our review of the research, we're confident that a UBIG could play a defining role in catalysing a fairer and more hopeful future, not just measured against the metrics of GDP growth and the deficit, but in terms of the measures that actually do affect real people's lives: income, access to sustainable livelihoods, health, including mental health, gender equality, and social cohesion. So these are the areas that our recent IEJ research and the paper that Mark mentioned have focused on. We've produced the working paper and also a policy brief. We're also producing a series of maybe more digestible fact sheets that explore these different areas. And what we're particularly interested in is whether a UBIG can contribute to dismantling the underlying structures in South Africa's economy that keep millions of people trapped in intergenerational poverty. Our research focuses on experiences from cash transfer initiatives in low and middle income countries, and I'll just take you briefly through a few of our findings, but if I go on too long, Mark, please feel free to stop me. But the most direct and immediate impact of a UBIG in South Africa is, of course, to rapidly reduce the proportion of people living below the poverty line. And depending on the level of the transfer value or how much you're getting, this could effectively eliminate income poverty. And we've seen some indications of this effect, though of course not as pronounced, with the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant, which when it was reaching around 10 million people, was shown to reduce food poverty in 2021. So that's the immediate impact of the UBIG. It does significantly alleviate hunger and deprivation, but a lot of people then ask the question or have this concern that we could then end up stuck in an unsustainable welfare trap. And the evidence again suggests otherwise. Income support has positive impacts on employment, self-employment, job search, and on local economies. The evidence suggests that the security and autonomy provided by income support doesn't diminish people's motivation to do rewarding and productive work. And a comprehensive survey in South Africa showed that grant recipients are highly motivated to work. The largest barrier to work is just that there's not enough available jobs. But the cost of searching for work can be high. One survey in 2019, and this is before inflation, suggested that it is on average 938 Rand per month. So that's things like transport, data, airtime. And another recent survey from Youth Capital showed that 20% of young job seekers use social grants to supplement the cost of their job search. So while income support can help people gain waged work, it may also help workers to improve their collective bargaining power and negotiate for better conditions. This is because it gives them more options and the agency to turn down exploitative work. This can help to raise wages over time and reduce working poverty, as long as it's accompanied by strong labour protections, including a minimum wage floor. And alongside helping people to search for jobs and improving their working conditions, there's a lot of evidence to show that income support can lead to job and livelihood creation. So in initiatives in places like Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Zambia, Tanzania, Mexico, and elsewhere, income support has led to productive investment, the formation of enterprises, and increased self-employment, especially in rural or deprived areas. And this has created an income multiplier effect in many cases. That means that people who receive income support see their incomes increase at a rate over and above the level of that income support. In Namibia, income from self-employment increased 301% as the result of a basic income grant. In Zambia, there was an increase in consumption 25% over the value of the grant. So that essentially means that every rand spent on basic income can actually create a higher rate of return in the economy. Beyond supporting job creation and growing local economies, the impacts of UBIG on things like health and education are really critical to understanding how it can improve people's lives and drive long-term economic stability and growth. And our research shows that income support can improve nutrition and health outcomes, especially for child health. This is obviously a immensely valuable objective in itself, but it also supports children's physical and cognitive development into healthy and productive adults, so they have better outcomes in the labour market as well. But this must, of course, be accompanied by access to quality public health care. And there's also some really promising evidence showing that basic income support can improve mental health outcomes. So a study in Kenya found that income support actually decreased people's levels of the stress hormone cortisol. In addition, we recognise women's structural exclusion to be a key contributor to structural poverty in South Africa. So women are more likely to perform unpaid care work and to be economically dependent on men. Women, and especially Black women, are more vulnerable to poverty. And an over-reliance on waged work to reduce poverty overlooks this. It overlooks the fact that much of the essential work performed in our economy is unpaid and performed by women. And without this work, our economy would collapse overnight. So a UBIG paid to all adults rather than to the heads of households supports greater independence and autonomy for women and goes some way towards remunerating unpaid domestic and care labour. cash transfer interventions have also been shown to reduce vulnerability to gender-based violence. And just the last point that I wanted to touch on, Mark, is that the evidence also shows that income support, especially if it's universal, can contribute to improved social cohesion and social stability. And I think that that's something, that we can agree is needed in South Africa today, and is directly relevant to the problem of structural poverty. Research shows that social cohesion supports improved economic outcomes as well. So there is some evidence that cash transfers have also reduced crime rates. So in the pilot in Namibia, crime fell by 42% after the introduction of a basic income grant. But there's a big caveat to this, and that's that targeted or conditional cash transfers, which aren't universal, given to everyone, or which carry conditions that people need to change their behaviour, they need to do certain things in order to qualify. These can have the effect of increasing social division. So there was some evidence from Chad which showed that in a targeted cash transfer, non-recipients, people who didn't receive the grant, tried to undermine the benefits that went to recipients, such as their entrepreneurship and their consumption. So I think it's very important to acknowledge that, yes, the state faces a number of challenges in implementing a UBIG, and it can carry risks and externalities depending on how it's designed. It mustn't be seen in isolation as a silver bullet solution to South Africa's complex challenges, but it must be integrated into a comprehensive policy program of economic development, job creation, and social provisioning. But if this is achieved, we show in our research that it can have a significant impact on including those who are currently excluded from our economy due to factors that are outside of their own control. A UBIG not only lifts people above the national poverty lines, but it has the potential to unleash human capital and agency, to instigate a fundamental shift in the way our economy is structured. And I'll leave it there, Mark.
Thank you, Kelly, for a really excellent overview of the evidence and of your paper. You've covered a lot in a short period of time, and a number of people have said that it's very dense. But people can follow up and read on this. We put links into the chat I see have been put to your research paper. I'm going to pass on to Hein now, who will respond to your comments. Hein, author of a recent book on this subject. Let's hear your thoughts on this subject now. Thanks, Kelly. Hein, your turn.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to Daily Maverick for arranging this session. Everybody who's joined, thanks for taking the time to join us and debate this. Kelly's excellent presentation means I can speak for much less time. I want to touch on a couple of things, reiterating perhaps some of the points she's made, but also I think dwelling for a moment on the structural nature of the crises that are giving rise to these debates that we're participating. We're an example of it today in talking about a universal basic income. Globally, we are in a period and entering, I think, a long-standing, almost chronic succession of crises. We hear the word of polycrisis being thrown around, this idea of multiple intersecting crises that reinforce one another, overlap, blend, and start making it very, very difficult to disentangle them and deal separately with each and every one of them. They're economic, they're ecological, they're social, they're political. And South Africa, in many ways, I think, is at the sharp end of this kind of process, this kind of reality that's unfolding across our planet. It is extremely difficult for millions of people to achieve and sustain a viable and stable livelihood in South Africa today. We're not unique in this, but we are absolutely in a situation of horrifying difficulty. Even in the best of times, 30+% of people are unemployed at the moment. And I'm talking about the extended definition, which is the more reasonable definition of unemployment. At the moment stands at about 43 to 44% of the population, the adult population, cannot find a job. The important thing for me is to remind ourselves that this is not an aberration. It's not a cyclical trend. It is a long-standing, decades-long structural feature of our economy. Our economy functions, it's structured in ways that produce enormous wealth, but it does so without the paid labor of close to half of the adult population. For millions, many millions of people, paid work that is available is so insecure in addition to this, so insecure, so erratic, so poorly paid that it doesn't rescue those households from poverty and hunger. As I said, South Africa is not the absolute only place experiencing this. It is a global phenomenon as well. We know from International Labour Organization data, for example, that work that is decently paid and stable is very rare in so-called developing economies. It's becoming increasingly atypical in developed ones. Around half of the workers in Africa and about 1/5 of workers worldwide, talking around 640 million people, live in what the ILO calls extreme or moderate poverty. Somehow they live on less than $3.20 per day. In South Africa, roughly 40% of people with paid work, people who can find work, can't afford basic living expenses of their households. Roughly 22% of those working in the formal sector live in poverty. And the upshot of this, and these are statistics even from before COVID hit us, more than half of South Africans were earning less than 1,000 rands per month, and a quarter of us were living in food poverty. So we live in a context here, especially in South Africa, that in my book, I call it double fiction. This idea that paid work is actually available to those who seek it, and that if you can't find it, it will offer you material security. It's a double compounded fiction. In reality, people are trapped between an economic and a social order that insists that they sell their labor in order to survive, and an economy that only needs the labor of a tiny fraction of them. And around that, those of us who are too young, too old, or too frail to work can access tiny social grants. And the rest, as Mark said earlier, are left flapping in the wind. Our system of income distribution in South Africa is broken. Our economic and our social policy models fail to provide many millions of South Africans with a reliable basis for dignified life. And it's on that reality that I think the debate for the UBI has to proceed. It's a recognition of these multiple failures and the multiple crises that we're beginning to experience and that are almost certainly going to accumulate in the years and decades ahead. I just want to finish by touching on the issue of how we define a UBI. It's become the subject of polite debate, something it certainly wasn't a decade ago, all around the world. But we have to understand as well that it's a very slippery and unstable concept. It means different things to different people and to different sets of interest in society. The UBI that Kelly and I are talking about here today, and I think many others would support, is, as she said, a regular monthly payment to all adults. It's not conditional on any change of behavior. It's not means tested. You don't have to prove your poverty in order to access it. And it's preferably also not targeted only at specific sections of a population. That's what makes it universal. It's not universal because it replaces other forms of support, other forms of social provisioning, public goods and services, like free primary healthcare, free primary education, subsidies for transport, water, electricity, you name it. It is an addition to those entitlements that we as residents and citizens of the country should have. And fundamentally, and this is like my final point, Mark, if you allow me, a UBI recognizes that social citizenship are productive ways in which we contribute to and belong to society is not tied solely to performing waged or paid work. It recognizes the many rich ways in which we contribute to and build and sustain and improve our neighborhoods, our communities, and our society at large, that there are many ways in which we work that aren't paid or remunerated. And in its very particular way, UBI recognizes this absolute reality, which at the moment goes unremunerated and in many respects unrecognized as well. I just want to reiterate finally a point that Kelly made right at the end. It is not a standalone fix. We're not pretending that it's a magic bullet. It has to operate as part of a revamped development strategy, by which I mean macroeconomic policies, industrial policies, labor policies, social policies have to be revamped to address the crises that I described a few minutes ago. It is not a magic bullet, but it can achieve unbelievably important things in preparing and sustaining us through what lies ahead.
Thanks very much, Hein, for another wonderful presentation. You've both laid out the picture for us, and let me ask you a couple of questions. I think you two are on the same page. You're both clearly, on the basis of your research, proponents of a universal basic income. You see it as a necessary part of a paradigm shift. You see it as necessary for poverty alleviation. You see it as necessary for development, strategy to tackle health. You've put multiple arguments in favor of universal basic income. Are you hiding arguments against universal basic income? Can you, in as succinct a way as possible, say what are the arguments that are being made against it? Because, you know, as I sit here and I listen to the two of you, one of the questions going through my mind is, this is not a new debate. I think the idea of a universal basic income grant in South Africa was first raised 20 years ago, probably, by Vivian Taylor in the Taylor report. You have put a large amount of evidence forward as to why it is an idea whose time is come, why it's a right, why it's a necessity. Why is there such resistance to this? Why are advocates and researchers for a universal basic income seem to be banging our heads against the wall? Kelly, can you kick off on that, if you don't mind, and then perhaps Hein can add to it. And then while you're answering my questions, I think we should be joined by Zimbali Mncube, and I'm going to throw a couple of questions to him, which have been posed in the chat about affordability, which I know is one of, again, the big issues that is thrown up as an argument as to why we can't do this. But we'll go there in a minute. Kelly, why so little? Why so overwhelming but so little traction apparently?
Thanks for the question, Mark. I jotted down a few thoughts as you were speaking. I think that there are some clear kind of areas of resistance to this idea, and quite often, I just want to say the evidence that we present in our paper is research that has been very well traversed. There's a significant amount of evidence in this area. All we've done is kind of collate it, present it, and discuss how it's relevant to South Africa. But you would think, I'm surprised at the level of resistance that there is in the face of such overwhelming evidence. But we do hear some common arguments made against the basic income grant and the UBI, especially in the South African context. And one of the most common reactions that people have is this going to lock poor people, and especially young people, into dependency on the state? Will they live the rest of their lives on this basic income grant and still not be able to enter the workforce, still not have other agency and other options in their lives? And will this then just be a welfare trap where the government is spending more and more money on supporting people, but ultimately it doesn't give people greater control over their lives? And I can understand that reaction and that fear. Ultimately the goal is to get people participating in the economy and in society. But the research really doesn't support this as a possibility, unless the grant is set at such a low level that it traps people in poverty. So it doesn't give people the ability to go out and search for jobs, like I was talking about earlier. It doesn't give people the ability to choose to undertake care work or to choose to enter the economy, to create their own enterprises or enter the informal economy. So the dependency question has really been debunked. It is still something that we hear often, and I hope that, you know, eventually that evidence filters through to show that what the basic income support does is increase people's independence, not increase people's dependence on the state. Sorry. Okay, that's the main one. So maybe I should hand over to Hein.
Let me go to Hein, because I also want to get to Zimbali in a moment, but you've made a very important argument, and maybe we'll come back to the other point you wanted to raise in a minute. Hein.
A couple of things I think strike me, maybe three issues. The one obviously is this unease that many people in government and in the public have with the idea of dependency. And I think we have to understand where this comes from. It's rooted fundamentally in the idea that we can and should be sovereign, autonomous individuals. Now, in the history with colonial and apartheid ways of structuring society and our participation in it, such as South Africa's, I think this idea of being sovereign and autonomous is one that we cling to because it was robbed and deprived of so many millions of people in our history. This idea that we are not somehow beholden to other realities and forces and powers in society. So I think it's an ideological principle which is very much tied to the neoliberal era of capitalism, the idea that individuals decide their own fate, but it also has a particular resonance in South Africa because of our particular experiences and histories here. In reality, of course, we know that factors beyond individual control decide the distribution of capabilities and resources and opportunities in society. We know reality means we are always dependent on each other. Even as a worker, I am dependent on the person or the structure employing me, and vice versa. So it's a difficult one to unpack, but it's very real. The other one, Mark, very briefly, I want to touch on, I think is a very real concern and has to be taken seriously, is the idea of people receiving, and I'm putting this in air quotes, something for nothing. It's the idea that we have to reciprocate for what we get from the state. And in the ideological framing that we grow up learning and living in, waged work is that giving back that we do in order to get something, which is the income that we earn. There are many other ways in which we give and contribute productively to society, as Kelly mentioned a minute ago. Many of them or most of them go unrecognized, or not seen as productive work, and they go unpaid. So I think the something for nothing concern, as valid as it is, has to take account of these kind of blind spots, these hidden and forgotten ways in which every single member of society does in many ways contribute productively to their neighborhoods, their communities, their society, and so on. The final one is the issue of affordability, and we'll hear that spoken to in a minute, so I'll let it be the moment.
Thanks very much, Hein. Before I come to the question of affordability, I just wanted to knock one question on the head, and also to say that I am going to come to this question of strategy that Hassan Lorgat is raising. Who's supporting it? Who's opposing it? How do we make headway on this? So let me just plant that with both of you. But before I go to Zimbali, just one other question from Zoe Masilo. Maybe Kelly, you can take this. If we get a universal basic income grant, will there be prescriptions as to how you can use the money? She says, would citizens be free to use the UBI as they please? Would there be considerations around the UBI being spent on sin expenses, alcohol, tobacco, gambling, etc.? I know that's a thing that you frequently hear, that people are going to take the social relief of distress grant and spend it on booze and cigarettes and so on. Kelly, can you just very quickly just address that question?
Thank you for the question. We do touch on this a little bit in our paper because it is another area of resistance to the basic income grant. I think it's connected to ideological questions about whether recipients deserve this kind of assistance. And I think that those kinds of questions don't necessarily help us. The evidence certainly shows, especially in low and middle income countries, that there isn't a lot of support for the idea that that social grants are spent on so-called temptation goods like alcohol and tobacco. There's also evidence for this from South Africa. Assessment of the introduction of the SRD COVID-19 grant showed that it was overwhelmingly spent on food, followed by electricity. And I think we can expect a similar outcome for a basic income grant. So it's not supported by the evidence. And the other point I would make in response to this is that in practice, kind of prescribing and policing how a grant like this should be spent is incredibly difficult bureaucratically. It would in some ways kind of undermine some of the positive impacts of the grant because there would be an enormous cost and an enormous amount of administration involved in trying to impose these conditionalities and police them. Ultimately, if we see the grant as a right or as a dividend, something that everybody is entitled to by virtue of being a member of a society, we shouldn't need to then prescribe the economic choices of people, because whatever they spend the money on, the money goes back into the economy and contributes to resilience and growth.
Thanks, Kelly. So we're on to matters of economy, and Zimbali's now joined us. How's it, Zimbali? Nice to have you here, the IEJ's budget analyst and researcher. Zimbali, one of the arguments that is frequently made is that this is just not affordable. I've seen it in the chat that we're already struggling to finance healthcare, we're struggling to finance basic education, and now we want to introduce a new grant that will cost potentially a few hundred billions of rands. How do you deal with this affordability issue? And can you also just say a little bit about the debates that are going on at the moment around social relief of distress grant, which has now been extended for another year at 350 Rand per person? Do you think 350 Rand per person would be enough, for example, for a basic income grant? Kelly said something about one of the problems potentially of a basic income grant would be a basic income grant that was introduced at a level that is too low and therefore doesn't allow people to escape the poverty trap and to gain the independence that they need to function in society. So, Zimbali, a couple of thoughts on these issues, please.
Thank you for the opportunity, Mark. So just to begin, I would start in how often the question is understood or framed by those who disagree that a basic income grant is affordable. Most of the time it's linked to the gross cost, which is usually the sum of what the grant would cost when you don't take into account, for instance, the economic multiplier effect it would have in the economy once people have received the cash grant and they are purchasing goods and consuming from their local economies. This doesn't also take into account the injection that the money would result into poor households, right? And so taking that into account, and also the revenue that would be generated through VAT, for instance, and a clawback mechanism, you have the net cost, what we call the net cost, which is minus these benefits, is much lower than what it would cost if you are only looking at the gross costs, right? And then you come to the question of how we can actually finance it. We've looked at a number of tax proposals to potentially fund an intervention like a basic income grant. And I will mention three, from income taxes to consumption taxes and possible wealth taxes, right? The first one is a social security tax, right? And this is a form of tax that would be levied on income for those who earn around 80,000 per annum going upwards, right? And so it would be levied at a rate of about 1.5% to 2.5%, depending on how much people and depending on their tax bracket. And so a social security tax like that would allow us to recoup about 67 billion, right? Depending on which level do we tax it. And then there's also a resource rent tax, right? And in other countries like Zambia and Ghana, it has been levied at about 25% of the natural resource rent, right? And in South Africa, if we put that in place, we could raise just under 40 billion, right? This is what one of our policy briefs has showed, right? And then there's consumption taxes, which is we've looked at the luxury VAT because we know that the normal VAT would harm households that have low income, but also in the context of rising food prices and energy prices, it would be regressive. And so a luxury VAT would be a VAT imposed on those who purchase luxury goods, and it would be levied at 25%, and this could raise about 8 billion, right, to 9 billion in the medium term. And then lastly, the wealth tax, which is one of the wealth taxes we've looked at, and studies that have been done on this show that 1% tax rate for the top 1 and 3% could raise about 143 billion, right? And so these are some of the ways that I think we need to consider when we are thinking about the financing of an intervention like a basic income grant. But of course, they would require very careful sequencing as well as a discussion with different stakeholders to manage the unintended consequences that they might have on revenue or even the intended beneficiaries in this case.
Mark, if I may just add, if I can just add a couple of points to that, thanks. Yeah. I think there's, in talking about the affordability of it, we have to recognize as well that this is a technically important and I think neglected discussion at the moment here, and having an open-minded debate, not across battle lines, but from a shared desire to try and address the kind of crises that we've been talking about. But ultimately, the decision is a political one. It is a political decision about what is affordable and what is not. And we actually in South Africa have a couple of experiences over the past 2 decades where we were told repeatedly that certain interventions were absolutely unaffordable, off the table, and within a few years had become affordable for reasons that we're not going to go into here right now. The one was the expansion of social grants in the early to mid 2000s, which came on the back of the failure of the attempt to have a basic income grant introduced in South Africa. The other, as you know very well, Mark, having campaigned for it, was the provision of free HIV treatment in South Africa. We were constantly told it was impossible. It wasn't. Today we have the largest HIV treatment program in the world, and we pay for it ourselves, unlike many other countries in the world. So this political dimension is fundamentally important, and with it also the need for the public at large to understand, participate in this debate, and hopefully come around in support for it in large enough numbers to shift the political intransigence that we're seeing at the moment.
Thanks very much, Hein. So it's a political question probably more than it's an economic question, is I think what you're arguing. And what I take away from what Zimbali has just said is that it is affordable, that there are financing options, a variety of financing options that have been researched and are available to a willing government. And I'm also right, Zimbali, in understanding that you don't just see the basic income grant as a drain, as a cost on the fiscus, but also as potentially a stimulant to economic growth amongst the part of the population that is currently basically effectively excluded from the economy. Is that right, Zimbali? And maybe Kelly, you can add to that, but be very quick because time is now ticking away, and I want to spend a few minutes on this question of where does this issue go from here?
Yeah. No, that's correct, Mark. I also think it's linked to the question of how. I think the key point there is the form of taxation that we propose needs to be progressive, right? In the manner that those that are wealthy contribute more, and those that receive a lower income are the net beneficiaries in this intervention that we propose. And it's also linked to the point raised by Kelly earlier that it's also about the value of the grant, right? It's a low grant like the SRP, for instance, is not only negative because of the value that people can use to purchase into the economy, but it also wouldn't bring the necessary stimulus that we are talking about to stimulate local economies.
Thanks, Zimbali. Anything, Kelly, you'd like to add on that particular point?
I think, on the wider point of affordability and net cost versus, net benefits, I think it is important to reiterate that this is a political question. Affordability, especially kind of in the arena of government finances, isn't just a technocratic matter of yes or no, we can afford it or we can't afford it, but it implies competing worldviews and priorities. Whose interests are we willing to prioritize and whose aren't we? What are we willing to sacrifice and what aren't we? And what do we see as a risk? I think there are, the modeling is there to show we can actually do this. It is affordable. The net costs are much lower. The way we implement it can result in net benefits accruing to the most vulnerable. Actually getting there is another question, and how we can mobilize, how we can build a coalition to not only institute a basic income grant, but to institute it in a way that ensures that it does have these benefits. That's a much more complicated question.
Thanks. Hein, anything from you just on this particular issue? I see there was a comment in the chat that this stop the socialism, and somebody else said that that we're having a one-sided discussion because I think everybody on this panel is in favor of a universal basic income grant. I know Business South Africa is not in favor. They've come out and said that it's unaffordable and that it shouldn't be introduced, and they have a lot of sway over the South African government, business leadership, South Africa. How much longer are we going to continue having this discussion? What is it going to take to get movement on this particular issue, Hein?
Just on the comments of it's being one-sided, I'll maybe share something that's not obvious. I didn't come to researching and thinking and writing about the UBI as a convert at all. I was a quite intense skeptic of it initially. And in my research, I gradually wove my way across from one side of the road to the other, for, against, and I arrived at the kind of position that I tried to share very briefly here. and more elaborated in the book, of course. So I think it's just plain common sense as to how we get there. There's something to bear in mind here. I said earlier that a UBI is a very slippery concept. It can mean and be made to do very different things in society as well. It is not something that necessarily will do the bidding automatically and inevitably of the people who design it or the struggles that achieve it. And I think there are a few deductions we can make from this, things we can learn as we move forward. The one is that it will take struggle, it will take campaigning, it will take convincing, and it will take I think very clear thinking about the potential of a UBI and the drawbacks of it, because there are some, in campaigning for it. We will only achieve a UBI, I think, through a process of mobilizing enough public, organized and other support for it. And this is a process that's only beginning in South Africa right now. But when we look at surveys, for example, we see growing public support for the idea. The most recent one I was privy to yesterday spoke of more than 60% of people in the national poll supporting it. So that's starting to build, but it has to take organizational form. It has to be a kind of momentum that has organizational impetus and can be focused tactically as well. My last point is, even if we win, even if we achieve the UBI that we've been talking about here today, it will have to be defended constantly, because it does impinge on other interests in society. It is not something everybody is going to agree on in society. It does imply redistributing assets and income in a very, very unequal society. Those who have will not give that up very easily. And UBI is about struggling for a better South Africa. It's not just about a technocratic decision made and a law passed. And I think that's the fundamental thing we have to come to grips with now.
Thank you so much, Hein. I'm going to take those as your closing comments, unless you, in a minute, you feel that strongly that you have something you want to throw in just in conclusion. To Zimbali and Kelly for just closing thoughts and a provocation from me as well, or perhaps a couple of things you can address in closing. There was a question, are there issues around executing this? If we decide, yes, we're going to introduce universal basic income, can we do it? Do we have the systems to be able to do it? That's one question I'd like you to talk to. And the second thing is, you know, in South Africa, we have a constitution, as I said at the outset, that's framed in rights. We say that people have a right to sufficient food, people have a right to health, people have a right to water, people have a right to basic education. Do you people think that access to money should be a right in this modern world? Yeah, maybe just reflect a little bit on that as well, because the impression that I get is the notion of a world or an economy that provides that provides full employment, even half full employment, is something that belongs to history. It's never going to happen. We are looking more and more at a world without jobs, or jobs as we've always been brought up to think about jobs. So how do you have money without jobs? Zimbali, then Kelly, and then I'm afraid we'll have to bring this webinar to a close.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, on that first question, I think one of the things that we've seen with the rollout of the SRD grant is that the infrastructure is there. However, over time, it would need to be developed as we aim to reach a much wider group that we are currently reaching now. And that universality is much more preferable and least administratively easier to implement, as opposed to a targeted grant. And so you see this in the example that Kelly spoke to about when the grant was, the threshold for the grant was decreased to 350, for instance, we couldn't reach the intended beneficiaries, as opposed to when we had a wider net or a higher threshold. And so I think for me, that example is a positive example. and where we can take lessons as to how do we build on from there. And then the questions about taxations already, SARS has shown to be a good in revenue collections of late since it was revolutionized. And so I think those institutions need to come to the party more, and even institutions in government need to cooperate. That is the Treasury, DST, SASSA, and all those agencies that are involved to ensure that we have a progressive rollout of the grant.
Thank you very much, Zimbali. Kelly.
Sure, thanks. I agree with Zimbali that we should see the SRD as the beginning of a pathway towards a UBIG. And that's what the IEJ has taken as a starting point. So we do think that this gives us an opportunity to build on and to execute, as you say. I see someone in the chat, questioning this idea, is the infrastructure really there when we've seen all of these problems with the rollout of the SRD? Those problems have actually been connected to efforts to target, to impose conditions, to exclude certain people from receiving the grant. Actually, the rollout of a universal basic income is administratively much simpler. And as I said at the beginning, it cuts down on the possible opportunities for fraud and corruption. So yes, I do think that the capability is there, the infrastructure is there. We're also very clear that this is something that needs to be and can be phased in incrementally. We're not talking about introducing something tomorrow that then creates a shock to the tax base or anything like that, although this has been, what we've been accused of saying in some quarters. We see this as something that the value of the grant can be progressively increased over the course of a few years, or that it can be progressively rolled out to more and more parts of the population. And that is certainly in line with the government's obligations for providing social assistance under the Constitution. And just to the question of people's rights, is access to money a right? I think that access to a decent life is a right. Access to basic needs is a right, and that's what a basic income grant is really trying to achieve. There are some factions, on the, I think I've heard some arguments from the kind of far left questioning, is cash the answer? Is giving people money is still kind of predicated on participating in this capitalist system, which is inherently exclusionary. Ultimately, the most direct way of ensuring people can get their basic needs met now, can live a decent life now, is by giving them money. And I think that it is very difficult to argue against putting money directly into the pockets of poor people to enable them to realise their right to a decent life.
Thank you very much, Kelly, for those powerful closing comments. Thank you too to Zimbali and Hein. And thank you to everybody who has participated in this discussion. I see that the chat has been very active. I'm sorry that we've only had an hour, because in the course of this short hour, I've just realized again how big and complex and multidimensional this discussion is. But I hope that the hour has been sufficient to introduce to people who may not have been aware of the parameters of this debate, or the issues at stake, or all of the research and evidence that has been gathered over time of just what that evidence is and what the arguments are. This is a discussion that obviously will have to continue. It's not an academic discussion. It's not an abstract discussion, because, as I think all three speakers have said, it's about millions of people's lives and rights to dignity in South Africa and all over our planet. So please, those of you who've joined us in the audience, read the work, the research of the IEJ, read Hein Marais' book. I'm sure they'll be happy for you to make contact with them if you have any questions, and exercise your rights as rights-bearing citizens under the South African Constitution to push for something that is planted deeply in our Bill of Rights, the right of everybody to have access to social security, to autonomy, to dignity, to life. So I'm grateful to the Daily Maverick, to Nicole, who, as usual, Nicole Williamson, has set up this webinar, and I wish you all safety and health and a good day. Thank you. That's the end of today's webinar. Goodbye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.